The spotlight finds Dean Martin like it always does, cutting through the smoke and whiskey haze of the Copacabana on that sweltering July night in 1956. The room pulses with the electric energy of New York's most exclusive nightclub, where movie stars and mobsters sit elbow to elbow, united in their worship of the two men on stage. Dean leans against the piano, cigarette dangling from his lips, that famous half-smile promising the audience they're about to witness magic. Beside him, Jerry Lewis bounces like a live wire, manic energy crackling through every gesture, every perfectly timed pratfall. This is the 10th anniversary of the greatest comedy duo in entertainment history. It's also their funeral. To the audience, Dean looks bored, almost arrogant, the king of cool who seems above it all. The tabloids will spend the next 4 decades painting him as the ego, the one who walked away because he wanted the spotlight all to himself. They'll call him cold, calculating, the heartless crooner who abandoned his fragile genius of a partner. The narrative will be simple. Dean Martin was too selfish to share the stage, but the world was looking at the mask, not the man. If you stripped away the tuxedo and the spotlights, you'd see the subtle tremor in Dean's hand as he reaches for his drink, not from alcohol, but from a profound, silent grief that would follow him for 40 years. What the audience doesn't know, what even Jerry doesn't fully understand in this moment, is that Dean isn't walking away to save his career. He's walking away to save his best friend from a toxic dependency that's slowly killing them both. He's about to carry the burden of being the bad guy so Jerry can be the victim, because Dean knows Jerry needs the sympathy more than Dean needs the approval. The band keeps playing, but Dean has already left the building. Not just the nightclub, the partnership, the friendship, the only relationship that ever truly mattered to him. And for the next 40 years, he'll keep a secret so profound, so quietly heroic, that it will only surface after both men are gone. A secret about anonymous envelopes stuffed with cash, about hospital bills paid in the shadows, about a man who spent 4 decades proving that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go, because that's what heroes do in the dark. They don't pose for pictures. They just stand guard, even when no one's watching, even when no one will ever know. The secret Dean Martin carried to his grave wasn't about scandal or shame. It was about a promise made in a dressing room in 1946, when 2 hungry young men from nowhere swore they'd always take care of each other. Dean kept that promise until the day he died, even when keeping it meant the world would think he'd broken it, even when it cost him everything else that mattered. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now let's go back to 1946, to a shabby dressing room in Cleveland, where 2 nobodies made a promise that would define both their lives. The Holland Inn Hotel in Cleveland is trying to hold on to its dignity in the summer of 1946. But the gilt is wearing thin around the edges. The backstage area smells of sweat, hair tonic, and the ghost of last night's applause that never quite made it past the cheap seats. In a cramped dressing room, lit by a buzzing fluorescent tube, Dean Crocetti sits before a cracked mirror, rolling a cigarette with the practiced ease of a man who learned long ago not to rush disappointment. At 29, he's already carrying the weariness of someone who has seen the world's rough edges. The name on the cardboard sign outside reads simply, Dean and Orch. The cheap ink is already bleeding. Then Jerry Lewis explodes through the door. Not walks, explodes. 20 years old, all elbows and nerves, dropping his props and apologizing to furniture. Dean watches him fumble with a suitcase that won't close, watches him check his reflection 17 times in 30 seconds, watches the tremor in his hands as he tries to light a cigarette. Most people would see a clown. Dean sees a scared kid wearing his father's suit, trying to convince the world he belongs here. "You Dean?" Jerry blurts, already halfway into the room. His tie hangs like a question mark, his eyes bright but not steady, bright in the way of someone who can't bear silence. "Depends who's asking," Dean says without turning from the mirror. It comes out lazy, but not unkind. "Jerry Lewis, I'm on after you. Or before you. Depends who bombs worse." He laughs too loud at his own line, then deflates when Dean doesn't join in. "They said I should show respect to the singer." Dean turns, extends his hand. Firm, steady. "Relax, kid. Nobody respects the singer. We're just here so the busboys have something to dance to." Jerry's laugh this time is real, cracking through the tension like a match striking. That night, something magical happens. Dean stands at the microphone, his voice pouring out like warm bourbon, and the room settles. Then, Jerry bursts onto the stage, lost, asking the band if they've seen his mother. It should ruin the moment. Instead, the place explodes. Dean looks at this manic clown invading his song and makes an instant calculation. He steps back, gives Jerry space, lets him flail and shriek while adding a deadpan line here, a knowing smile there. They don't just kill that night, they commit murder. Hours later, after the crowd has spilled into the Cleveland night, they sit in that suffocating dressing room. Jerry paces, still wired, but underneath the manic energy, Dean sees something else. Fear. The same terror Dean recognizes from his own mirror on bad nights. "You think they really liked us?" Jerry asks, and his voice betrays the child hiding behind the performer. Or was it just a fluke? The conversation drifts from comedy to fathers who expected too much, mothers who worried too loudly, the particular loneliness of standing in a spotlight and feeling unseen. 2am comes and goes. Outside, Cleveland quiets. Inside, two broken young men find the thing they didn't realize they'd been working without. A witness. "Dean," Jerry says finally, softer now, without performance. "If we do this, if we really do this, whatever happens, we look out for each other. No managers, no sharks, just us. You got me, I got you, no matter what." Dean studies this kid with the desperate eyes and frantic jokes who just lit up a dead Tuesday crowd like New Year's Eve. He sees the neediness, the anxiety crackling under Jerry's skin like a shorted wire. He also sees the heart behind it. He extends his hand. "Whatever happens, we take care of each other, no matter what." They shake on it. No lawyers, no contracts. Just two hands, two wounds, one promise. The next morning, Dean discovers Jerry owes a local bookie money he doesn't have, the kind of debt that comes with broken finger interest. Jerry is hyperventilating in the alley, convinced he's going to die before his career starts. Dean doesn't ask questions. He just takes the cash from his own wallet, money he needs for rent, and handles it quietly. Jerry never knows. That's how Dean wants it. When he returns, Jerry looks up with panic-wide eyes. "It's handled," Dean says simply, lighting a cigarette. He never mentions the money. He never mentions what it cost him. Dean walked out of that dressing room owing money that wasn't his and carrying a burden that wasn't his to bear. He had no idea he'd still be carrying it 50 years later. By 1952, Martin and Lewis aren't just entertainers. They're a cultural earthquake. The Colgate Comedy Hour owns Sunday nights. Paramount executives weep with joy at box office receipts that Shatter records monthly. From the Copacabana to the Sands, they're selling out faster than tickets can be printed. America has fallen so deeply in love with the handsome straight man and his manic genius that they've become more than performers. They're a two-headed hydra of pure entertainment, devouring everything in their path. But behind the golden curtain of their success, Dean Craschetti has transformed into something he never intended to become. Jerry Lewis's human anchor in a storm that never stops raging. The promise they made in that Cleveland dressing room 6 years ago has metastasized into something unrecognizable. What began as brotherhood has become a full-time job that Dean never applied for but can't seem to quit. The phone rings at 3 in the morning. Always 3 in the morning. Jerry's voice crackles through the receiver from the next hotel room, high and brittle with the kind of panic that can't wait for sunrise. "Dino, you awake? I've been thinking about the bit where I fall down the stairs. What if it's not funny? What if they don't laugh? Be honest with me." Dean sits on the edge of his bed, cigarette glowing in the darkness, while his own wife sleeps alone in another city. He talks Jerry down, the way he's learned to do, with patience that costs him pieces of himself he'll never get back. The glitch starts small, almost imperceptible. Jerry missing a radio spot here, a publicity meeting there. Dean covers, improvises, makes it work with that effortless charm that makes everything look easy. The crew laughs it off. Boys will be boys. Then Jerry starts arriving late to film sets. Not fashionably late, but catastrophically late. 10 minutes becomes 20, then an hour. Then something that stops being lateness and becomes something else entirely. On a sweltering Tuesday morning at Paramount, the entire production sits idle for 4 hours. Grips check their watches. Makeup artists clean their brushes for the third time. Extras, paid by the day, fidget in period costumes that grow more uncomfortable with each passing minute. The budget hemorrhages money at a rate that would make studio heads physically ill if they knew. When Jerry finally arrives, he's a trembling mess of apologies and excuses, his hands shaking, his eyes wild with the kind of terror that has no name. The assistant director opens his mouth, probably to say something about professionalism or respect, or the 100 people who've been waiting. Dean steps in front of him like a human shield. "My fault," Dean says, smooth as aged whiskey. "I gave Jerry the wrong call time." It's a lie so transparent it insults everyone's intelligence, but Dean sells it with that famous smile, and the ad swallows whatever he was about to say. Later, in the commissary, Dean overhears 2 crew members talking. "Martin's getting lazy," one says, "shows up on time but doesn't give a damn. Lewis is the one who cares, even if he's a mess." Dean doesn't correct them. He just takes another drag of his cigarette and lets the world think what it wants to think. The pattern crystallizes with brutal clarity. Every time Dean covers for Jerry, every time he absorbs the blame and smooths the ruffled feathers, Jerry doesn't get better. He gets worse. The lateness becomes chronic. The demands become absurd. Jerry begins treating crew members with a disdain that would be shocking if anyone dared to call him on it. But they won't, because Jerry Lewis is box office gold, and Dean Martin is there to make sure the gold keeps flowing, no matter what it costs. The tabloids paint Dean as the boozy passenger on the Jerry Lewis Express, the lucky crooner who shows up, sings his song, and collects his check. They call him lazy. They call him ungrateful. The crushing irony is that Dean has become the only professional in the room, the only adult holding their chaotic enterprise together through sheer force of will. He's working twice as hard to make it look like he's not working at all, carrying the weight of 2 careers, while the world assumes he's coasting on Jerry's genius. The breaking point doesn't arrive with thunder and lightning. It comes on a quiet evening in his dressing room, Dean sitting alone with a script for their next picture. He's read it 3 times, hoping it will improve with repetition. It doesn't. The jokes are stale. His character is a cardboard cutout designed to showcase Jerry's manic energy. And worst of all, the whole thing assumes the audience will keep laughing at the same formula forever. He realizes he's not reading a script. He's reading his future. 10 more years of this. 20, until one of them breaks completely. Dean lights a cigarette and stares at his reflection in the mirror, seeing something that terrifies him more than any bad review or failed joke ever could. His loyalty, the thing he's most proud of, has become a prison. By shielding Jerry from consequences, by absorbing every shock and smoothing every crisis, he hasn't been helping his friend grow. He's been helping him stay a child. The mathematics are brutal and undeniable. Jerry needs Dean to function, but that need is killing them both. The realization that follows is the most painful of Dean's life. The kindest thing he can do for Jerry is the cruelest thing Jerry will ever experience. He has to leave, not because he doesn't love Jerry, because he loves him too much to watch him destroy himself. Not because the money isn't good or the fame isn't intoxicating, but because love that enables destruction isn't love at all. It's just a slower way to die. The decision doesn't bring relief. It brings a grief so profound that Dean can barely breathe around it. He's going to have to stand up, walk away, and let the world think he's the villain. Let Jerry think he's been abandoned by the one person who promised never to leave. He'll carry the truth alone, in silence, for however long it takes, because that's what the promise really meant. Back in that Cleveland dressing room when they were just two scared kids with nothing to lose. Taking care of each other doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means having the courage to go. The final show at the Copa was approaching. Dean had made his choice. He just hadn't figured out how to break Jerry's heart without destroying his own. When the curtain finally fell on Martin and Lewis at the Copa in 1956, the entertainment world treated it like a messy divorce they could dissect over cocktails for decades. The body they were examining wasn't dead. It had just split in two, each half destined to prove the other wrong. America, which had loved them as a single organism, now had to choose sides. The choice, it turned out, wasn't difficult for most people. Jerry Lewis threw himself into directing with the manic energy of a man trying to outrun his demons. The Naughty Professor, The Bellboy, films that critics called revolutionary, ahead of their time. Jerry transformed from comedian to auteur, earning the respect he'd always craved, proving he was more than just the idiot kid everyone thought they knew. Dean Martin, meanwhile, drifted into the sands, into the Rat Pack, into a persona so effortlessly cool it bordered on narcotic. Standing on stage with Frank and Sammy, a cigarette in one hand and what looked like scotch but was often apple juice in the other, he became the embodiment of not caring about anything. The narrative crystallized with brutal efficiency. Dean Martin, the cold-hearted egomonist who abandoned his sensitive genius partner because he wanted the spotlight all to himself. Jerry Lewis, the wounded artist who gave everything to the partnership only to be betrayed by the one person he trusted. When interviewers asked Jerry about the split, his eyes filled with tears that looked genuine, because they were. He talked about feeling abandoned, about losing his brother. The audience devoured it. Nobody bothered asking Dean, and when they did, he just smiled that famous smile and changed the subject. Frank Sinatra couldn't stand it. He cornered Dean one night at the Sands, bourbon in hand, anger crackling in his voice. Defend yourself, for Christ's sake. Tell them what really happened. Tell them about the 3 a.m. phone calls, the babysitting, the whole damn thing. Dean just shook his head, staring into his glass like it contained answers instead of liquor. What good would that do? Jerry needs to be the victim right now. Let him have it. Frank threw up his hands in disgust, but somewhere beneath his frustration, he understood. In their world, loyalty sometimes looked like silence. What nobody knew, what nobody would know for decades, was that Dean's loyalty hadn't ended when the partnership did. It had just gone underground, transforming into a clandestine operation of protection that would rival any intelligence network. Anonymous donations began flowing to the Muscular Dystrophy Association, Jerry's passion project, his reason for living. The checks arrived through intermediaries, law firms, shell companies with meaningless names, 20,000 here, 50,000 there, always with ironclad instructions that the source remain confidential. Jerry's telethon became the most successful charity event in television history, and buried in that success, invisible and unacknowledged, was Dean Martin's money. Behind the glittering facade of Jerry's newfound respect, he was falling apart in ways the public couldn't see. The Percodan addiction started as pain management after a fall on set, and became something hungrier, more demanding. His spending spiraled into madness, houses he didn't need, investments in ventures that smelled like scams from miles away. His need for approval became pathological, driving him to work himself into exhaustion, to demand perfection from everyone around him. Dean heard about it all through the industry grapevine, through mutual friends who didn't realize they were serving as an intelligence network, through insiders who mentioned Jerry's name and watched Dean's face carefully for reactions they never got. The interventions were surgical and invisible. When Jerry faced financial ruin from a disastrous real estate deal, a mysterious benefactor bought out his position at a loss. When he needed treatment for his addiction but couldn't risk the publicity, a private clinic in Switzerland received an anonymous donation large enough to build a new wing, with one condition: absolute discretion for a particular patient. When predatory producers tried to exploit Jerry's desperation with contracts that would have destroyed him, those producers suddenly lost financing from sources they couldn't identify, and the deals evaporated like morning fog. The cost of this silent vigil showed up in places most people didn't think to look. A secretary who worked for Dean in the late 60s remembered, in an interview recorded in 1998, how his face would change when Jerry's name came up on television. The smile would stay, she said, her voice soft with old grief, but something behind his eyes would just die, like watching someone get shot in slow motion over and over again. A sound engineer who worked both their shows recalled Dean standing in a hallway at NBC in 1967, watching Jerry's variety show on a monitor, tears running down his face that he didn't bother to wipe away. When asked if he was okay, Dean just nodded and walked away. Dean's silence became his second career, more demanding than any performance, more exhausting than any tour. Every interview where he deflected questions about Jerry, every time someone called him cold or selfish, and he just smiled and absorbed it. Every moment he had to pretend the split was about ego instead of love. The mask he wore on stage became the costume he could never remove, because removing it would destroy the mythology that Jerry needed to survive. For 20 years, Dean watched Jerry from the shadows, protecting him in ways Jerry would never know. Until Frank Sinatra decided the silence had gone on long enough. Labor Day, 1976. Las Vegas shimmers in the desert heat like a mirage built from neon and desperation, and inside the Sahara Hotel, Jerry Lewis is conducting his annual resurrection. 22 hours into the MDA telethon, he moves across the stage like a man possessed, his voice cracked from pleading, his tuxedo wilted, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and determination. This is his cathedral, his confessional, his chance to transform suffering into hope, $1 at a time. The phones ring constantly. The donation board climbs toward impossible numbers. Jerry Lewis has found his purpose, and it's beautiful and terrible to watch. Backstage, in the shadows where the cameras can't reach, Dean Martin is falling apart. The man who turned coolness into an art form, who could hold a martini glass steadier than most surgeons hold scalpels, stands with his hands trembling like autumn leaves. This isn't stage fright. Dean Martin doesn't get stage fright. This is the raw, existential terror of a man being forced to confront the one thing he spent 20 years running from. Frank Sinatra paces nearby, cigarette burning between his fingers, watching Dean with the concern of a friend who's just realized he might have pushed too hard. "You can still walk," Frank mutters, only half joking. "We call it off. Say you got sick." Dean doesn't answer. His eyes are fixed on the monitor, showing Jerry on stage, telling a story he's probably told 1,000 times, his animated gestures casting long shadows under the hot lights. 20 years of silence, 20 years of watching from the shadows. And now, Frank wants to drag him back into the light, back into the gravitational pull of the only person who ever really knew Dean Crocetti from Steubenville, Ohio. Frank's plan had sounded simple when he'd pitched it weeks earlier in a smoky lounge booth. A surprise reunion, a ratings bonanza for the telethon. A way, maybe, to stitch up an old wound that had never stopped bleeding. Dean had said yes before he had time to think, before he remembered that some wounds don't close, they just learn how to hide. Now, standing in the wings, he understands what he's agreed to. He's about to walk into 20 years of suppressed emotion on live television in front of 50 million witnesses. The moment arrives with the particular weight of inevitability. Frank strolls onto the stage, arms wide, the conquering king of show business, and the audience roars its approval. He banters with Jerry, trading lines with the ease of old professionals, until he glances toward the wings and delivers the words that will rewrite entertainment history. "I have a friend here who loves what you do every year." Dean steps into the light. Watch the footage closely, frame by frame, and you'll see something the casual viewer misses. Jerry's back is to the entrance when Dean appears, but he senses something shift in the room, the sudden intake of breath from the audience, the change in the energy that only comes when the impossible becomes real. He turns, and the expression that crosses his face isn't performance. It's the raw, unfiltered reaction of a man seeing a ghost he's been talking to in his head for 20 years suddenly materialize into flesh and blood. They move toward each other like men underwater, fighting against resistance that exists only in their shared history. Dean's famous swagger is there, but it's brittle, held together by will and muscle memory. His smile tries to remember how to be real. When Jerry sees him clearly, recognition hits like a physical blow. His mouth opens, closes, opens again. He looks small suddenly, vulnerable in a way that has nothing to do with the cameras or the crowd. When they embrace, time fractures. Dean's arms shake, not from age or weakness, but from the sheer effort of holding back 20 years of grief and love and regret that's trying to escape through his skin. Jerry's tears come immediately, the way they always did. But these aren't the practiced tears of a performer milking a moment. These are the tears of a man who's been waiting half his life for this, who's rehearsed this reunion in his mind so many times that the reality of it short-circuits something fundamental. Dean tries to speak, and his voice betrays him. "So, you workin'?" He manages, and it's both a joke and the only thing he can say that won't completely destroy him on national television. The line lands, the audience laughs, the tension breaks just enough for both men to remember they're professionals. But if you watch Jerry's face in that moment, you see the desperation of a drowning man who's just been thrown a rope he's not sure he can hold on to. What the cameras capture is beautiful and heartbreaking, and exactly what America needs to see. Two old friends, reunited at last, love conquering all the petty grievances that kept them apart. What the cameras miss is everything that matters. They don't see Dean's eyes, which remain guarded even in the embrace, protecting something he can't afford to give away. They don't capture the way his smile never quite reaches the place where real peace lives. They don't notice that while Jerry is pouring everything into this moment, Dean is carefully measuring out exactly what he can afford to spend. The segment ends. The music swells. The world celebrates what the television special will later call the reunion of the century. But when the cameras stop rolling, Dean doesn't go to the after-party. While Jerry is surrounded by handlers and well-wishers, while the entertainment industry gathers in various hotel suites to toast the historic moment, Dean slips out a side exit. He walks past the limousines, past the fans screaming his name, and gets into his car. The neon bounces off the windshield, painting him in colors that don't belong to him. He doesn't start the engine. He just sits there in the silence of the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turn white. For the first time in 20 years, the king of cool lets the mask slip completely. His shoulders shake. Tears come, not show tears, not controlled, cinematic grief, but deep, guttural sobs pulled from 20 years of silence, because he knows the truth that the tabloids will miss completely, that the fairy tale narrative will never acknowledge. They didn't reconcile. They performed reconciliation. The hug was real. The love was real. But the reasons they couldn't be together were still real too. Jerry was still Jerry, needy, chaotic, consuming. Dean was still Dean, guarded, protective, solitary. The chemistry that made them magic was the same chemistry that made them toxic. Some wounds are too deep to heal, Not because the love isn't there, but because the love is exactly what made the wound so deep in the first place. The next day, the headlines scream about peace and brotherhood. Dean goes back to his life, and Jerry goes back to his. They don't start hanging out. They don't make a movie. The silence returns, heavier now, because they both know what it feels like to break it. But something does change. In the weeks following the telethon, the anonymous donations to the Muscular Dystrophy Association quietly double, then triple. The lawyer handling the transactions notices the increase and mentions it to Dean, who just shrugs. The kids need it, he says, and changes the subject. He never mentions Jerry's name. He doesn't have to. Seeing Jerry's work up close, witnessing the genuine good he was doing, the exhaustion in his eyes and the lines on his face, reminded Dean of the promise he made in that Cleveland dressing room 30 years earlier. Whatever happens, we take care of each other. He couldn't be Jerry's partner anymore. He couldn't be his friend in the way Jerry wanted, but he could still be his protector. The world thought they'd made peace, but Dean knew the hardest part was still coming. The thing that would break him completely was already in the sky. March 21st, 1987. The phone call arrives in that dead space between night and morning when the world holds its breath and bad news travels fastest. Dean Martin is 70 years old, and in 70 years he's built an empire of cool so impenetrable that even his own family sometimes forgets there's a human being underneath. The voice on the other end is saying impossible words about his son, about Dean Paul, about an F-4 Phantom jet that vanished into the San Bernardino Mountains during a training exercise. Missing. Search and rescue. No survivors expected. The king of cool shatters like dropped crystal. What happens to Dean Martin in the hours and days that follow isn't grief in any conventional sense. It's the complete structural collapse of a man who spent 7 decades learning how to not feel, only to discover that some pain is too massive to deflect with charm or bury under performance. He stops eating, stops sleeping in any meaningful way. The famous smile, the one that could sell anything from cigarettes to salvation, vanishes completely, replaced by an expression of such profound absence that friends start avoiding his eyes. He wanders his house like a ghost haunting his own life, picking up photographs of Dean Paul and setting them down again, as if repetition might somehow rewrite the ending. The entertainment world watches in horrified silence as their icon of effortless living demonstrates what happens when the effort finally becomes too much to bear. Dean Martin, the man who made indifference an art form, who could joke his way through divorces and career slumps and health scares, simply ceases to exist. In his place is a hollow shell, someone going through the motions of living without any of the substance that once made those motions seem effortless. Then Jerry Lewis does something he hasn't done in 30 years. He picks up the phone and calls, not through an assistant or a manager or any of the elaborate machinery that celebrities use to maintain distance. Just Jerry calling Dean the way he used to when they were young and the world was smaller and promises still felt like magic instead of chains. For the first time in 3 decades, the voice on the other end isn't performing. Dean, Jerry's voice is stripped of all artifice, all ego, all the manic energy that once defined him. It's just the voice of a man who knows what it feels like to be broken. I'm coming over. Don't tell me no. Dean doesn't say no. He doesn't have the strength to fight, and perhaps in the deepest part of his grief, he realizes that the only person who can sit in this darkness with him is the one person who saw him before the lights turned on. The funeral for Dean Paul is a private affair, carefully shielded from the media circus that would have devoured it whole given half a chance. Among the mourners, dressed in a simple black suit that makes him look older than his 61 years, is Jerry Lewis. No cameras, no publicity, no performance. He stands in the back, respecting the space between them even in grief. But when Dean sees him, something passes between them that has nothing to do with the 30 years of silence or the public narrative or any of the complicated machinery they built around their broken friendship. It's recognition, pure and simple. Two men who have survived too much, acknowledging that survival is sometimes the cruelest punishment of all. After the service, after the other mourners have paid their respects and drifted away into their own lives, Jerry approaches. "Can we talk?" he asks, and his voice carries none of the desperate neediness that used to define their relationship, just exhaustion and something that might be wisdom. They sit in Dean's study that night, two old men surrounded by the artifacts of extraordinary lives, and for the first time since 1956, they talk without masks. Dean's defenses, battered by grief into something resembling honesty, finally crack open. The words come slowly at first, then faster, tumbling out like they've been waiting 3 decades for permission to exist. "I never left you because I didn't love you, Jer," Dean says, his voice rough with tears he's too tired to hide anymore. "I left because I couldn't watch you kill yourself, and I couldn't be the one handing you the shovel." Jerry sits perfectly still, and for once in his life, he doesn't interrupt, doesn't perform, doesn't deflect with a joke or a gesture. He just listens as Dean continues, the confession pouring out of him like blood from a wound that's been sealed too long. "I was killing you," Dean explains, staring into his drink. "Every time I covered for you, every time I made it easy, I was helping you stay broken. I couldn't stop protecting you, so I had to go." He looks up, meets Jerry's eyes for the first time. "But I never stopped watching out for you. All those years, Jerry. I was still there. You just couldn't see me." The revelation hangs in the air between them, and Jerry's face does something complicated. Recognition, grief, gratitude, regret, all fighting for space in an expression that's too honest for either of them to look at directly. "The donations," Jerry says quietly. It's not a question. Dean doesn't confirm or deny, but his silence is its own answer. He talks about the anonymous checks, the medical bills paid for crew members, the quiet interventions when sharks were circling Jerry's production company. He lays it all out, not as a boast, but as a confession, the desperate, silent acts of a man trying to keep a promise he couldn't keep publicly. They don't fix everything in that conversation. Some breaks are too old, too fundamental to ever fully heal, but they reach an understanding, a kind of peace that has nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with finally being seen. Jerry leaves that night knowing what Dean sacrificed. Dean is left alone with the knowledge that at least one person in the world understands the weight he's been carrying. But the weight doesn't get lighter. If anything, losing Dean Paul makes it unbearable. The Dean Martin who emerges from his grief is barely recognizable. He withdraws from public life almost completely, turning down offers and appearances with a finality that makes it clear this isn't a negotiation. The man who once owned Las Vegas now rarely leaves his house. The famous charm is gone, not hidden, but actually absent, like a limb that's been amputated. He sits in his den, watching old westerns with the sound off, drinking not to get drunk but to numb the screaming silence in his head. Yet even in his withdrawal, even as he fades from the world that once couldn't get enough of him, the anonymous donations continue. The checks to the Muscular Dystrophy Association keep arriving, processed through the same labyrinth of lawyers and intermediaries. If anything, they increase, as if Dean, having lost everything that mattered to him personally, has decided to pour whatever remains into the one thing he knows will outlive him, Jerry's mission to help children who are suffering. In his final years, Dean makes one last arrangement. His lawyer receives instructions that are to be executed after Dean's death, instructions regarding a trust that will continue supporting the MDA in perpetuity. The amount is staggering, the kind of money that could have bought comfort or legacy or any number of things a dying man might want. Instead, it's earmarked for kids with muscular dystrophy, for Jerry's telethon, for the work that gives Jerry's life meaning. He signs documents ensuring that a significant portion of his estate's charitable giving will be permanently directed to Jerry's causes, with a simple stipulation: the source must remain anonymous until both of them are gone. Dean never tells Jerry about this final gesture. He never tells anyone. It's just one more secret added to a collection that's grown too heavy to carry, but too precious to put down. Even at the end, he refuses to take credit, refuses to change the narrative, choosing to let Jerry be the hero of the story while remaining the invisible hand that makes the heroism possible. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning, 1995. The secret died with him, or so the world thought. 8 years after Dean Martin's death, his estate finally emerges from the labyrinth of probate court, tax disputes, and legal complications that follow famous men into the grave. The lawyers handling the settlement receive keys to storage units scattered across Los Angeles, anonymous spaces that Dean maintained for decades without telling anyone in his family they existed. When the first metal door rolls up, revealing rows of bankers' boxes stacked with methodical precision, they expect memorabilia, forgotten props, the usual detritus of celebrity. Instead, they find a secret history. The boxes contain decades of financial records, canceled checks with amounts that make seasoned attorneys pause and recount, handwritten notes in Dean's surprisingly neat script detailing payments and purposes that were never meant to see daylight. At first, it looks like ordinary financial history, agents, managers, the usual choreography of famous money. Then a pattern begins to shimmer beneath the numbers, like an image slowly emerging in a dark room. Box after box, year after year. There they are, anonymous donations to the Muscular Dystrophy Association, routed through shell companies with instructions that the source remain permanently confidential. Payments to a family trust established for Jerry Lewis's children, disguised as investment returns from ventures that never actually existed. Medical bills for crew members who worked on Martin and Lewis films, their cancer treatments and heart surgeries paid in full by a benefactor they never knew. The paper trail stretches back 40 years, beginning barely 2 years after the split and continuing until weeks before Dean's death. But the most devastating discovery comes from Dean's desk, not a storage unit. An envelope, unsealed, addressed to no one. Inside, a letter in Dean's handwriting, the ink slightly faded, but the words still sharp. No preamble, no explanation of context, just a man explaining himself to ghosts. "I don't know if I did right," the letter begins. "Leaving Jerry, I mean. I've spent 40 years wondering if there was another way, some path where we both got to be happy and whole. I never found it. Maybe some people are just meant to love each other from a distance, like stars that burn brighter when they're not trying to share the same sky." The handwriting grows messier as emotion interferes with fine motor control. I couldn't watch him destroy himself, and I couldn't stop trying to save him. So I did the only thing I could live with. I left where he could see me, but I stayed where he couldn't. The lawyer who handled Dean's charitable giving for 30 years, now in his 80s with no career left to protect, finally agrees to break his professional silence. In a recorded interview, his voice trembles as he confirms what the documents suggest. Every major financial crisis in Jerry Lewis's life was quietly resolved by Dean Martin's money. The telethon that made Jerry a humanitarian icon was built on a foundation that included millions from the man Jerry thought had abandoned him. When Jerry Lewis learns the truth at 77, he sits in silence for nearly an hour after reading the documents. When he finally speaks, his voice carries the weight of 40 years of misunderstanding collapsing into clarity. "He was protecting me," Jerry says to no one in particular. "All those years, I thought he didn't care. He cared so much he was willing to let me hate him." The revelation spreads through Hollywood, and other beneficiaries begin coming forward. A session musician whose daughter's cancer treatment was paid by an anonymous donor, a crew member whose house was rebuilt after a fire with money from a studio fund that never existed, a Korean War veteran whose PTSD treatment was covered by someone who identified himself only as a friend. Each story adds weight to a truth that transforms our understanding completely. The man who made everything look easy was carrying the weight of the world, and he never let anyone see him sweat. That's not just cool. That's courage.